Before I get started, I must say, can you guys hear me? Okay, before I get started, I must say that some of you may be a bit uncomfortable with my talk today. My talk is on race, and we know race is a very contentious topic, right? For a long time, in particular here in the United States, race has been one of those enigmas, very complex set of variables, meaning biology and the environment. And so when you think about race and how the human species are distributed across the world, over the last several hundred years, there's been a lot of discussions in terms of naming these races and what are these so-called races. And so today I'm going to talk some about the biology of race and how race is problematic in biomedical research, okay? So I say it's problematic because if you look through the literature in biomedical research or in the popular press, we're hit every day with these ideas that race predicts disease or race impacts one's health, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that, for instance, African Americans have a higher risk for prostate cancer or a higher incidence of stroke? Does that mean that there's some biological sort of risk factors that the African Americans have, or does it mean that the environment is playing a role? And so when we use race, it's very difficult to tease apart the risk factors. And so when we, in biomedical research, historically, race has been used as a crude proxy for some shared biology, which means in the individual, the biology, the genotypes, and the shared environment. And that's SES, diet, lifestyle, different exposures. And so it becomes really problematic when we use race as this proxy. We should instead tease apart those potential variables and study the biology of the individual and study the environment to understand complex disease. One of the ways that we do that is by using what we call genetic ancestry. And so we've been very instrumental in developing markers called ancestry informative markers that are quite useful in understanding individual genetic variation as it relates to ancestry. And this is important because genetics is playing a bigger and bigger role in our lives. In particular, in the next several years, in particular the next 5 or 10 years at the most, we will use genetics to better define our risk, individual risk for disease, and also which drugs are more efficacious for us as individuals. And so the Human Genome Project was sort of ushered in this era of genomics. And we know that, what do we know about genetics? Well, we know that we get half of our DNA from our mother and the other half from our father, which is why we resemble our parents in one way or another. And sometimes your mother may say, you look like your daddy, or you act like your daddy, right? And I would say to my mother, yeah, I hope I do. You know, it's supposed to be my daddy, right? But for the most part, half of our DNA comes from our parents, each one of them. And we get some shuffling. But within the genome that we have, in every cell of our body, there are genes. And those genes code for things like skin color and eye color and hair texture and body height, body weight, but also susceptibility to disease. And as a geneticist, I'm really interested in how genetic variation plays a role in risk for disease. And so here we are now in this era of genetic, what I call genomic ancestry, and the challenges related to health, because in this era there are some more challenges. We have this technology now, and we're asking pretty much the same questions with the new technology. And so the challenge is, how do we use this technology to better assist us as it relates to health? What's one of the biggest challenges? The issue of group definition and membership. What does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be European American or Native American or Asian American? Those terms are kind of fluid, and if you look through time, they change. African Americans, for the most part, have been defined by social legislation. In the 1850s, the one-drop rule, the rule of hypodescent. You have one ancestor who's black, you're black. That one rule created so much diversity in the African American population. Even if you think about the gene pool of African Americans, it's very diverse before that because it's rooted in Africa, right? West Africa. But when you add to that all of the gene flow, or what we call admixture, from Europeans and Native Americans, it creates even more diversity in the African American population. So the issue of how do we define these groups continues to be fluid. And the technology is interesting because it allows us to assess at the genetic level ancestry, while at the individual social cultural level, you may think you're one thing, but genetically you may be something else. And so it creates an interesting tension for us because folks have to reconcile the data, the genetic and the environmental data. Can we accurately assess genomic ancestry? How does ancestry relate to skin color and SES? How useful is it for informing us about disease risk? We know that there are certain diseases that are more prevalent in particular ethnic groups than others. Will ancestry help us understand those differences in risk? And then, of course, the most important, health disparities. Are they due to biological differences? I think for the most part, a lot of them are due to social cultural differences and behavioral factors, but biology may be important too. And then, of course, when we stop using race and use ancestry, we have to also, how do we prevent ourselves from repeating the past abuses of race? And so when we think about complex disease, there's that social component, and then there's the genetic component. And so I want to split up what we call race, the biological and the social, into the ancestral genetic and the biological, meaning the social component. Because we can't throw away race, if you think about it. I mean, that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. While we know that there are no human races, there are important demographic populations that are defined by race in the United States. And I think that they could be, it's important to use that terminology as we measure inequalities and surveillance. So here we are looking at genetic ancestry. So how do we define genetic ancestry? Well, we've been involved in developing these markers called ancestry informative markers. These are markers that are throughout the genome, and they allow us to estimate overall continental ancestry, meaning West African or Native American or European ancestry. An interesting study out of Cleveland, Ohio, where individuals were looking at, this is in the middle of a big debate. Should we just ask people what they are, self-report, or should we look at these markers and type these markers and estimate ancestry? What they found was those individuals who self-reported as white had on average less than 10% African ancestry. If you look at this on the x-axis here, you'll notice that those who self-reported as black, there's a wide range, what we call a wide variance in genetic background and genetic ancestry. And so there are significant numbers of individuals who have less than 50% African ancestry. And so that represents the African American gene pool, what we call a macro-ethnic group of individuals of diverse ancestries, okay? When we think about African Americans, if you just think about physically, the skin color, hair color, eye color, and texture, we see a wide range of variation in the population. You also notice Halle Berry up there twice. I won't say why she's up there twice. But even Barack Obama is considered African American, right? One of his parents is white, the other one is of African ancestry, of East African ancestry. Unlike most descendants of enslaved Africans here in the United States, he is considered black because he has an African father. And so when you think about the gene pool of all of these individuals, it's very diverse. And that diversity could impact how their response to drugs are, and then also their risk for particular diseases. But when you group them all together into one and call that a race, it is problematic. I tricked you. He wasn't African American. That's Vijay Singh, the golfer. Now some of you say, well, I can tell who's black and who's white just by skin color. Well, in the United States, race has been used, skin color has been used to define race, skin color and ancestry, right? And so Vijay is of East Asian ancestry, right? So he doesn't have any African ancestry. He's dark because of his ancestry in the tropical region. And so when we look at the variation across the world in terms of skin color, we find that populations that are along the tropics, 20 degrees north of the equator, 20 degrees south, are the darker darkest populations in the world. And so it's important to understand that variation and not sort of just use this, this bottle called race when we define these individuals. So what is it about skin color that ties and also separates so many different human populations? Well, these specialized dendritic like cells called melanocytes produce melanin. They are the cells that are in the between the dermis and the epidermis of the skin, and they produce melanin upon exposure to sunlight. And so you can see some of the melanin molecules there. Our lab has been responsible for a lot of the identification of genes that have been involved in melanogenesis, or the production of melanin. And so we've been trying to understand how these genes play a role in variation, not just in African Americans, but in populations throughout the world. But back to African Americans. The bulk of the African American gene pool comes from West and Central Africa, from northern Senegal to southern Angola. Very diverse populations, diverse culturally. Many different languages are spoken, many different cultures and religions, but also biologically. And you can find the vast array of phenotypes and skin colors, hair colors, nose shapes throughout this region of West Africa. And for the most part, about 95% of the enslaved Africans that came from this area were brought to the Americas. About 5% came from East Africa. And so it's important when we try to understand genetic variation in African Americans, it's rooted in West Africa. And so we have to understand African variation also. But for the most part, this is where we find African Americans. The Crescent South, this is a census map of African Americans. This is by county. So the darker these areas here on the south, that's where we find the bulk of the African Americans. Here's the Mississippi River, here's Chicago and Detroit. We don't find a lot of African Americans out in the middle of the country out west, probably unless they're playing basketball or football, I don't know. But here out west, we see a large number in Oakland. So this is important to understand as one who tries to study and understand African American genetic variation. This is also where the bulk of the enslaved Africans came from. So while a lot of African Americans went up north for better jobs and opportunities, a lot of African Americans still stayed in the South. Look at this. This is where Hispanics are in the United States, according to the last, the 2000 census. So one would suggest that there is enormous segregation in the United States. At the macro level, we think about segregation at the micro level, but even at the macro level. So what I find also interesting is the Hispanics in the southwestern parts of the United States, these are mainly Mexican Americans, are quite different genetically from the Hispanics in southern Florida and in New York, DC, and Chicago. Those out on the eastern side have more Puerto Rican and Dominican and Cuban ancestry, but according to the census are grouped together because they speak Spanish, but genetically are quite different. And because of Tiger Woods, we now can say that we are of mixed ancestry in the census, right? And so where did individuals say that they're mixed? For the most part, out west, and in large numbers in particular in Oklahoma. And why Oklahoma? Because Native Americans. And so this is what I mean by the changing identities, and how when you look at the genetics of these individuals, a lot of them have European ancestry, some have Native American, but for the most part, there is no sort of very large numbers of Native Americans among those who self-reported as mixed ancestry in Oklahoma. And so this is a plot which we're able to, so we're able to sort of depict genetic ancestry for these individuals. These dark circles are African Americans, the open circles are European Americans, and you'll notice along the points of the triangle are the punitive parental populations. But I want to bring your attention to the red square. There are some African Americans who genetically have more European ancestry than some Europeans, but they self-report as black. And so if somebody were to ask me who's black and who's white, I couldn't tell you, because there's a reason why those folks said that what they are, and it's because of how they were socialized. I think that's very important to understand too. If we look at these Hispanic populations, these are Mexican Americans, and you'll notice the Native American European distribution and ancestry, but these are Puerto Ricans, another group of Hispanics, less Native American, much more West African ancestry. So we see, even within the Hispanic population, a very diverse set of ancestries. And so when we look at ancestry, we can actually look at it to the point where we can assess each individual chromosome and try to determine where these chromosomes came from, arose from, if they were of African ancestry or European ancestry. And we know that, for the most part, genes don't stay in your genes. Anytime you bring two people together, there will be some mixing. And so we can actually look at these chromosomes in individuals of mixed ancestry, like African Americans and Hispanics, and look along these chromosomes marker by marker and estimate where these segments of their chromosomes arose from geographically. In fact, this is my chromosome. I actually got this test done by a company called 23andMe. And you'll notice that I have this mosaic. So here I am thinking I'm 100% Mandingo. And in fact, I find that I'm only about 80% West African ancestry, and I have 12% European and 8% Native American ancestry. So my mother would be quite happy. She said, she swore that we were Native American, and I said, oh yeah, okay. But yeah, we do have about 8% Native American ancestry. And then we have that 12% there of European ancestry. And so this is the interesting situation where when I look at my Y chromosome, it doesn't go back to Africa, but it goes to Europe. In fact, it's quite common in Germany. And so I'll end there. Thanks.